In Haverbrook, the days had always begun the same way: birds scattered across telephone wires, sprinklers hissing over neatly trimmed lawns, and the faint sound of a school bus engine growling down the road. People in the town had grown so accustomed to the predictability of life that they rarely looked for anything unusual. It was a place where nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen, and that false sense of security made what came next all the more shocking. On an October morning, the sky was a pale blue and the air still held the sharpness of early autumn. A jogger named Daniel Turner followed his usual trail through the woods at the edge of town. He moved at a steady pace, headphones tucked into his ears, thinking of little more than the long day of work ahead. But his rhythm faltered when he spotted something unnatural resting just off the dirt path. It was a suitcase, battered at the edges, its surface damp from dew and faintly marked with soil as though it had been dragged. At first, Daniel thought it was nothing more than junk discarded by someone passing through. But its placement gnawed at him. It looked deliberate, too obvious, as if waiting to be noticed. He paused, hesitating, before curiosity and unease got the better of him. When he tugged the zipper open, the weight inside was heavy, unyielding, and wrong. For a split second, he convinced himself it would be full of old clothes or maybe tools. Instead, the reality was something he would never erase from his memory. Wrapped tightly in layers of black plastic was what could only be described as a body. A sickly sweet smell confirmed his worst fear. Daniel stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat, before he dropped the suitcase and ran for help. By the time police arrived, the trail was cordoned off with yellow tape. Officers exchanged looks that carried more dread than words ever could. The suitcase was carefully transported to the forensic lab, but the damage to the community had already begun. Rumors spread through Haverbrook like wildfire. People whispered in grocery stores, at gas stations, and in church pews. Children were kept inside after school. The air of safety the town had worn like a badge of honor was shattered in a single morning. When the medical examiner confirmed that the remains inside belonged to a young woman, the unease deepened. Haverbrook had been the kind of place where residents recognized each other by name, where life was built on handshakes and shared trust. Now every glance between neighbors carried suspicion. Parents checked their locks twice before bed, and dogs barked louder at night. It was no longer a story of a body in a suitcase. It was the story of how evil had entered a town that thought it was immune. The silence that once symbolized peace now carried the weight of fear, and everyone knew the nightmare had only just begun. The identification came quickly. The remains in the suitcase belonged to Melanie Cross, a 29-year-old receptionist at a local dental clinic. She had disappeared just a week earlier, and her absence had unsettled her family and friends, though many clung to the hope that she would eventually be found safe. When her name was officially tied to the grim discovery, that fragile hope collapsed. Melanie had been known as gentle and dependable, the type of person who never caused conflict and never strayed far from her routines. She was the last person anyone imagined being connected to such a brutal fate, and that very contradiction only deepened the mystery. Detectives immediately searched her small apartment on Maple Street, a tidy space that reflected her careful nature. Her dishes were neatly stacked, her bed perfectly made, and her bookshelf filled with romance novels. Nothing appeared out of place at first glance. But investigators have learned to look past surfaces, and their attention eventually landed on the bathroom. Behind a mirror, wedged into a shallow gap, was a slim notebook wrapped in elastic bands. Its cover was plain, but inside was something completely unexpected. Page after page contained handwritten notes, arranged in patterns that looked almost mathematical. Times, dates, and locations were scribbled in rows. At first the words seemed meaningless, but as detectives studied them, they realized the entries were tracking specific people. One page listed a coworker's name, followed by the hours she left work and the time she arrived home. Another entry described a neighbor's late-night movements. Strangest of all, some pages carried symbols and abbreviations, like a code that only Melanie could understand. The discovery unsettled everyone involved. Who had she been watching, and why? To friends and neighbors, Melanie had seemed like an ordinary young woman who lived quietly and kept to herself. But the notebook suggested another side to her life, one filled with secrets and silent observations. Investigators considered whether she had been conducting this surveillance voluntarily or if she had been coerced into it by someone else. The possibility that Melanie herself was hiding something disturbed them. Her family was brought in to view the notebook, and their reactions were a mixture of confusion and disbelief. They insisted Melanie had never mentioned anything unusual, never acted paranoid, and never suggested she was interested in other people's private lives. To them, she had been warm, soft-spoken, and trustworthy. Yet the evidence told a different story. The most haunting part was the fact that some names appeared repeatedly. Melanie had been following certain individuals with consistency, almost obsessively. Detectives began connecting dots and realized the information could be valuable. Perhaps the pages weren't random or obsessive at all, but warnings of something Melanie had uncovered. The more they considered the possibility, the more sinister it seemed. For the first time, the investigation stopped being only about who killed Melanie. It became about what she knew, what she saw, and why someone might have wanted her silenced. The notebook found in Melanie's apartment shifted the entire direction of the investigation. It was no longer a simple case of finding who had killed her, but of unraveling why she had been watching so many people in her own community. Detectives began methodically reaching out to every individual whose name appeared in her records. What they uncovered was unsettling in ways no one expected. The first person questioned was her landlord, a middle-aged man who seemed outwardly polite and reliable. On the surface, he was a respected member of the town, known for keeping his properties in excellent condition. But when investigators dug deeper, they found he had been operating an illegal cash-only side business, pocketing money and avoiding taxes for years. Melanie's notes had recorded his irregular comings and goings, which matched the times he was likely collecting unreported rent. Though it didn't directly connect him to her murder, it was enough to confirm that she had been documenting hidden truths. Her co-workers at the dental clinic were next. They painted Melanie as kind but somewhat private, someone who did her work without complaint. But one name in the notebook led to a revelation that rattled everyone at the office. A woman who had worked beside Melanie for over a year wasn't who she claimed to be. Fingerprints showed she had changed her identity years earlier, moving to Haverbrook under false documents to escape her past. Melanie had tracked her hours and interactions with almost obsessive detail, suggesting she had discovered the truth. The revelation created unease in the workplace and confirmed that Melanie's notebook wasn't random. It was a record of secrets, collected quietly and carefully. Even her closest friend wasn't immune. Investigators learned that this friend had been orchestrating small-scale fraud, convincing people to invest in non-existent projects. Melanie's notes included times and dates of her friends' late-night meetings and phone calls. It appeared that Melanie had been aware of activities that could have destroyed reputations and possibly sent people to prison. As detectives connected these pieces, a pattern emerged. Melanie had unintentionally been sitting on a minefield of hidden crimes, and nearly everyone she monitored had a motive to silence her. Yet one name in the notebook stood out, appearing far more often than anyone else's. Victor Hale. Victor was a quiet carpenter who lived only 3 blocks from Melanie. To most of the town, he was unremarkable, a solitary man who fixed fences, repaired furniture, and avoided social gatherings. But Melanie had recorded his movements almost daily. She wrote down when he left his house, when he returned, and who came to visit him. When police entered his workshop, they found shelves lined with wooden carvings. At first they seemed harmless, but on closer inspection, each figure was shaped like a human body, and none had faces. The carvings were unsettling, almost grotesque in their detail. Victor became the prime suspect, but detectives couldn't ignore the fact that Melanie's notebook revealed many possible enemies. She had seen too much, written down too much, and her silent investigation into the lives of others had placed her in the center of a storm she could not escape. Just as the investigators felt they had enough to close in on Victor Hale, the evidence took a sharp and chilling turn. For weeks, suspicion had circled him like a shadow. The faceless wooden carvings in his workshop painted him as someone deeply disturbed, someone capable of acts darker than most could imagine. But the science of the investigation told a different story. Forensic testing on the suitcase where Melanie's body was found revealed a vital clue: traces of skin lodged under her fingernails. Melanie had fought back, and her final struggle had left behind the imprint of her killer. The DNA was rushed through analysis, and when the results came back, the entire case shifted. The sample didn't belong to Victor Hale. Instead, it matched a man who had never once been considered: Thomas Reed. Thomas was the last person anyone would have suspected. He was a local teacher, known in Haverbrook for his calm and steady nature. Parents trusted him with their children, and neighbors described him as polite and soft-spoken. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and seemingly no connection to Melanie. When his name was announced within the police department, officers exchanged stunned glances. If a man like Thomas could be tied to something so brutal, then what else about Haverbrook was a lie? Investigators obtained a warrant to search his home, a modest house on a quiet street lined with trimmed hedges. The first sweep revealed nothing unusual: books on shelves, papers neatly filed, lesson plans stacked on his desk. But detectives pressed further, determined to uncover the truth. In the basement, behind a false wall cleverly disguised as part of the foundation, they found a hidden space. Inside was a collection so disturbing that seasoned officers were shaken. Hundreds of photographs covered the walls and filled boxes stacked on the floor. Every single one was of Melanie. Some were taken from across the street near her apartment, others from her workplace, and still more from the park where she often walked. The photos spanned months, each date carefully marked on the back. Some were close enough to show her expressions: smiles, frowns, moments when she looked over her shoulder as if she sensed she was being followed. As the evidence was catalogued, a chilling realization formed. The notebook Melanie had hidden wasn't evidence of her spying on others for no reason. It was her attempt to track her stalker. The dates and times she wrote down were aligned with Thomas Reed's movements. She had recognized she was being watched, and instead of panicking, she had tried to understand his patterns. Her hidden records were not the notes of a woman with secrets, but the desperate writings of someone trying to protect herself. The horrifying twist left investigators with mixed emotions. Victor Hale, whose carvings had cast suspicion on him, might have been odd, but he wasn't the killer. The true danger had been a man admired by the community, hiding in plain sight. The trusted teacher, praised for his patience and kindness, had been living a double life. And Melanie, aware of the predator lurking around her, had left behind a trail of clues that only made sense once her stalker was exposed. The arrest of Thomas Reed sent shockwaves through Haverbrook. Parents pulled their children out of his classes, the school board scrambled to erase his name from official records, and the community's image of the quiet, respectable teacher collapsed overnight. But what investigators uncovered after his arrest was darker than anyone could have prepared for. The basement, already lined with photographs of Melanie, revealed more layers of horror as evidence was carefully examined. In locked boxes hidden beneath floorboards were belongings that didn't match Melanie at all: scarves, bracelets, old phones, and house keys, each catalogued and stored like trophies. Every object hinted at another possible victim, yet no records of missing women in the area matched the items. The chilling possibility arose that Reed had preyed on women who had never even been reported missing, women who had somehow slipped through the cracks unnoticed. His journals added to the nightmare. Page after page detailed his obsession with Melanie. He described the first time he saw her leaving her apartment, the way she smiled at a neighbor, the sound of her laughter drifting through an open window. To him, these moments weren't harmless observations. They were the beginning of a fantasy in which Melanie existed solely for him. The more he wrote, the more twisted his entries became. He described her as belonging to him, convinced that their lives were intertwined by fate. When she began taking notes on his behavior, he grew paranoid. His writing revealed a terrifying logic: if she knew too much, she couldn't be allowed to expose him. Investigators pieced together the final days of Melanie's life. She had realized she was being stalked and intensified her efforts to document his movements. Her notebook was both a record of her fear and a warning she could never deliver. Reed, aware she was becoming more cautious, confronted her in a moment of calculated violence. The evidence showed she had fought back fiercely, leaving behind the DNA that would eventually expose him. Her courage in those final moments provided the very clue that led to his capture. The trial was swift, but the details that emerged made it unbearable for many in the community. Prosecutors revealed the photographs, the trophies, and the journals. Each piece of evidence painted Reed as not just a stalker, but a predator who had likely acted before. Questions mounted about whether other towns had missing women connected to him, but without clear matches, the answers remained elusive. The weight of the unknown was what terrified people most. For Haverbrook, the damage was irreversible. The quiet suburban town would never again feel safe. Parents kept tighter watch over their children, neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, and the memory of Melanie's tragic fate lingered in every corner. The suitcase that had been left by the wooded trail became a symbol of shattered innocence, A reminder that evil can grow undetected in the most ordinary places. Even with Reed behind bars, the haunting truth remained unsolved. Were there others? The evidence suggested yes, but the silence of missing names left the case with a void too disturbing to ever fully close. Haverbrook moved on in appearance, but the shadow of that October morning hung heavy, ensuring the story of Melanie Cross and Thomas Reed would never be forgotten. Thanks for watching this episode of Crime Uncovered. If you found the story gripping, don't forget to like the video, share it with friends who love true crime, and hit the subscribe button with the bell icon so you never miss our next disturbing case. Every click helps us uncover more untold stories.